So let's talk about shutter speed. I've got my Nikon D200 digital SLR camera with my 50mm f1.8 lens, and I'm going to show you a little bit about shutter speed, what it does, what it means to control it, how it affects the quality of your photograph, and some other things that might be helpful to know as you're learning more about photography. Shutter speed is one of the three key components that make up what we call exposure, or how much light's coming into your photo, and the others being aperture and ISO. Aperture is the width of the opening of your camera. A smaller aperture means a smaller opening at the lens here. A larger aperture means a larger opening at the lens. But today we're going to talk about shutter, and we'll talk about ISO in another video. So shutter is how long the opening stays open. The shutter in cameras, it's always closed unless you click the button, in which case it opens and then closes again. And that length of time is called shutter speed. A digital SLR camera like this lets you set the shutter speed, and then the camera can figure out the rest. In other words, the aperture and the ISO. And there's also what they call a program auto mode, where you can set the camera to figure everything out on its own. It will take care of all three components, the shutter speed, aperture, and the ISO. What I'm going to show you how to do today is work with just the shutter speed and the kind of different things that shutter speed will do to a photo. I also want to mention that pocket cameras work the same way in terms of a shutter and an aperture and an ISO, but they usually don't allow you as much control over these three elements. Whereas these cameras have a program auto mode, most pocket cameras have a full auto mode, which doesn't allow you a whole lot of control over the various settings of your camera, from aperture, shutter, and ISO. But if you load your pictures onto your computer, you can look up the metadata in the photo and find out what the shutter, aperture, and ISO settings are that your camera used. And if you know these, then it can kind of help you learn what to do to take better photos just by knowing what information the camera used. So how does shutter speed work? Well, to show you, I've got my camera set for a 1/90th of a second shutter speed here, and you'll notice that it opens and closes really quickly. Probably didn't even notice anything, but that brief 1/90th of a second was enough time to let enough light in to hit the image sensor to take a photo. Now I'm going to set it to 1 second, and you're going to see a bit of a change here. It actually took 2 photos in a row there, but each time you heard it open and close, and it took 1 second to do that. That let in a ton of light, way more than you need for most photos. But if it's really dark, like at night, you want to take a picture of the stars or some trees with the moon behind it, you'll need to let in all the light you can. And one way to do that is by opening up the shutter for a really long time. But what are the practical implications of shutter speed? Well, to show you that, I'm going to take a picture of my hand moving across the camera with a shutter speed of 1/250th of a second. Now, I'm going to change the shutter to 1/20th of a second. Take the same picture. You'll notice a couple things in these photos. The first photo is a little darker, but my hand is a lot clearer. The second photo is much lighter, but my hand is all blurry. So what does that mean? Well, if you need to take a photo of a lot of action, like let's say there's a soccer game going on and there's kids running all around, and you want to take a picture of, let's say your son or daughter's on the soccer team, there's plenty of light coming in because it's broad daylight, hopefully. And if you want to freeze the action of the soccer game, you set your shutter for really fast, like 1/1000th of a second. And doing that, because there's so much light coming in from outside, you can freeze the action for 1/1000th of a second, really see the players kind of stop in the middle of whatever they're doing in your picture. And it works out fine because there's plenty of light. And because there's plenty of light, you can also play around with your apertures. So you can try a large aperture if you want a really shallow depth of field, like let's say you want to focus on just one player. You can set your aperture to huge, like 1.8 or 2.8, and it'll give you this nice depth of field where that one player will be in focus and the rest will kind of not be in focus. And you'll see that in a lot of sports photography. You might see in the newspaper and Sports Illustrated. Or you can set your aperture to smaller, like f4, f8. and you'll see a much broader picture. You'll see the more people will be in focus from the front to the back of the shot. There's no right or wrong way of doing it, but it's just how you want to take your shot. A slower aperture, like a 1 second, 2 second, 5, 10 second, that's useful for when there's just not much light. Like at night, if you want to capture the stars or some kind of night scenery, or if you want to take a picture of, let's say, a waterfall and get that nice effect where the water is streaming over it and looks like it's sort of motion over time. You can set your camera on a tripod in low light for a really long shutter, like 10 seconds, 20 seconds, and you'll get that nice smooth effect of the water coming over the waterfall. But how do you actually set this stuff? To show you that, I'm going to illustrate with my camera itself here. Right now I've got my camera on shutter priority mode, which means I adjust the shutter speed and the camera figures out the rest. Here it's set for 1/30th of a second, and you'll see the number on the right is the f-stop. That changes too. Now it's 1/60th of a second, 125th of a second. And what you're going to notice is that as I make the shutter speed shorter, the number on the right gets smaller too. So 1/180th of a second, now we're at f2. 1/250th of a second, f1.8. What this number on the right is the aperture. The camera knows that in order to make the shutter speed really fast, like a 250th of a second, it has to let in as much light as possible in order to take the shot. To do that, it widens the aperture. And I said at the beginning that this is an f1.8 lens, which means that 1.8 is as big as the aperture will go. So to take a photo at 1/250th of a second, given the lighting conditions in this room, the camera has decided that a huge aperture of 1.8 is what it's going to need. Now if I make the aperture slower, like 1/20th of a second, given the amount of light in this room, the camera has decided that f5.6 is a good aperture to have. Is there a way to control both the shutter speed and the aperture though? Sure there is. On this camera, you hold down the mode button and then turn this back dial here. And now in manual, I can set the shutter speed and the aperture. And why would you want to do this if the camera already knows what's best for the shot? Well, the camera doesn't always know what kind of shot you want to take. Depending on the type of shot you want to take, a nature shot, shot of your kids, shot of scenery, of buildings, architecture, you might want full control over the shutter speed and the aperture, and also the ISO, which we didn't even get to today. So the camera doesn't always know what's best. It tries to figure out what's best, but it doesn't always get it right. The best thing to do is to actually start fiddling with your camera and fiddling with the shutter speed and aperture and these other things so that you start to learn what you want to do and how to take the photos that you want to take. I should also mention that one other thing you can do is use the flash in your camera. Nothing wrong with that as long as it is in line with the kind of photo you want to take. Not everyone is a big fan of using flash because of the effect it has on the lighting and the overall composition of the photo, but if that's what you want to do, that's fine too. The most important thing though is for you to play around with your camera and get familiar with it and learn this stuff on your own. If you've got a digital SLR camera like this, don't be afraid to play around with the shutter, or if you have a Canon, it's called the TV, time value mode, or play around with the aperture, the AV mode on your Canon. But all digital SLRs like to do this. They all have different ways of setting the controls, but play around with this stuff and just start trying different things and figure out what works. Pretty soon you realize that the camera doesn't really always know best, and once you start to figure this stuff out, you'll know a lot better than the camera will about the kind of picture you want to take, and you'll start to see a huge improvement in your photos. So that's it for this video. If you have any questions, let me know, leave a comment, and I'll do my best to address them. Thank you.